contemporary city is profoundly menaced, not by any outside danger, but by an evil shaping within itself. This is the evil of the machine. Because of the confusion of its different functions, its growing mechanization, the omnipresence and anarchy of the motor car, the city is at the mercy of industrial machines. If it is to be saved, its structure must change. And this change is inevitable, whether it comes through insight or catastrophe. The city must be changed, or it will perish, and our civilization with it. Siegfried Gideon.
All through the 20s giddy upward rise, New Yorkers had been pursuing another kind of dream. Not only upward, but out, into the expansive green and blue, that, as F. Scott Fitzgerald had seen, alone was limitless. Propelled by the rising prosperity and restlessness of New Yorkers, and by the revolutionary invention that, since the turn of the century, had become the shining emblem of both, this fateful movement, beyond the boundaries of Greater New York, would alter forever the relation of the city and the country, and challenge all previous assumptions about urban life.
The car disaggregates, the car unravels tight, closely knit, interdependent urban regions because it makes place less relevant. With a car, it doesn't matter where someplace is. So this relatively static, this relatively rigid grid of streets and buildings and railroad tracks has to somehow respond to this thing which is hungry and demanding, forces changes on the landscape. So the car takes pride of place among the variables that are going to place demands on the city. The car is the whole story.
In the decades to come, as the city moved through Depression, World War, and beyond, New York would become the arena of a titanic contest between the automobile and the pedestrian, between the highway and the city block, between the compact, if often congested, urban neighborhood and the sprawling, if often anonymous, commuter suburb. Before it was over, that contest would all but tear the city apart and force New Yorkers to confront the most elemental urban questions of all. What is a city? What makes cities work? Why should there be cities at all?
No city as complex as New York. No city that builds itself and rebuilds itself so often and often so well has a high point, has a magic moment. New York is a constellation of magic moments. What is astonishing about New York is how many of the magic moments of the past have managed to survive. We have lost a lot, but we've saved an awful lot. What are the magic moments of the 19th century? The optimism of the City Hall, sophisticated French-inspired building. What is another optimism? The Brooklyn Bridge. It's still there. What a leap the Brooklyn Bridge was. What a leap Commissioner's plan was, and it's still intact pretty much. What a vision Central Park was, and it's there. It's more beautiful now than it's been perhaps since the time of Olmsted. Add to that these incredible office buildings that were built, which concluded with some kind of visible symbol at the top. So I don't think we should think of New York as being a closed book. I mean, New York could be said to be like one of those incredible things you see in the 4th of July fireworks. It just goes boom, 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 and it keeps going. We don't know how many layers of that explosion will happen before it all peters out. And we, of course, hope that it will never peter out. New York is that explosion.
By the autumn of 1929, as the most spectacular decade in the history of the city came to a breathtaking close, New York seemed to have arrived at the very zenith of its dazzling career. In 300 years, it had grown from a tiny trading post on the far edge of the known world to become the undisputed cultural and economic capital of the world. Gathering in money and people from around the globe, it had made itself one of the wealthiest and most densely populated places on Earth. Its population rising from fewer than 5,000 in 1776 to nearly 7 million a century and a half later. Consecrated as no place on Earth to the power of commerce and money, and unbeholden to any outside force, it had made itself the supreme center of American life. Then, in one last glorious decade, from 1919 to 1929, finished bringing into existence a ravishing dream city on the island of Manhattan, which had become the most modern place on Earth.
One is stunned at the sight of these upright masses. Buildings 50 stories high. Straight lines everywhere, affirming the will to make room for millions. This is not an architecture for men. It is an architecture for human masses. One cannot understand it without first having enjoyed the thrill of adding enormous totals and of living in a gigantic, compact, and brilliant world.
In the end, the fever pitch of the 1920s, acknowledging no limits and building higher and higher, could never have been sustained. As if, like Icarus, the city had flown too close to the sun and then come tumbling back to Earth again. In the years following the crash of 1929, as the greatest depression in American history plunged the city and nation into economic gloom, two things would become fatefully clear. The city itself, acting on its own, could no longer meet the needs of its own people. And unfettered capitalism in New York, in a century and a half of relentless commercial growth, had been carried to its very limit. In the years to come, as the greatest domestic crisis of the 20th century swept across the city and the nation, New Yorkers would be forced to reinvent their city once again, on a massive scale, moving as they did into uncharted waters, from which there would be no return.